The entire family agreed I wasn't ambitious enough to marry into their world. Nobody asked what I was actually building in silence. Less than 12 months later, their annual family gathering was interrupted by news that forced every conversation in the room to stop at exactly the same moment. My wife, well, fiancé then, had a family who counted things. Place settings. Zeros. Years of tenure at firms with 3 names in the letterhead. That Thanksgiving, standing outside the pantry with 2 glasses of wine I'd poured and forgotten to carry back in, I heard her father say my name the way you'd describe a used car you were still deciding whether to buy. He's a nice enough kid, Richard Whitfield said. But Claire needs someone who's actually going somewhere. Not someone who's still figuring out what he wants to do with his life at 29. Her mother made a small sound of agreement, the kind that isn't quite a word. He does something with computers, her aunt offered, like she was defending me by accident. He does something, Richard said. I asked him twice at dinner. I still don't have an answer. I stood there with the wine getting warm in my hands, and I didn't walk in, and I didn't walk away either. I just stood in the hallway of a house that smelled like cedar and roasted turkey and listened to a room full of people I was supposed to be joining decide, without asking me a single real question, that I wasn't enough. 12 months later, in that same dining room, every one of those conversations would stop at exactly the same second. But that Thanksgiving, I didn't know any of that yet. I only knew the ice in my glass had stopped moving, and that Claire was in there somewhere, not saying anything either. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I should say how we got there, because none of it started with contempt. It started with a broken air conditioner. I'd met Claire Whitfield 18 months earlier, in an apartment building in South End where I was subletting a 1-bedroom that smelled like the last 3 tenants cooking, and she was 2 floors down, locked out at 11 at night, because her key had snapped in the lock. I had a flathead screwdriver and more patience than sense, and 40 minutes later we were sitting on her stairwell landing eating cold pad thai out of the same container because neither of us wanted to go back inside yet. She worked in commercial real estate, the acquisition side, the kind of job where she disappeared for 3-day stretches to Nashville or Raleigh and came back talking fast about cap rates. She laughed easily, more easily than anyone I'd met from that kind of money usually did, and she asked good questions and actually waited for the answers. I liked that she never once asked what my 5-year plan was. Not in the beginning. I was doing freelance data work then, cleaning up spreadsheets for small regional distributors, mostly furniture and industrial suppliers around the Carolinas, guys who were still running their delivery routes off a whiteboard, and a guy named Pete who'd been doing it since 1994. It wasn't glamorous. It paid the rent, some months barely. But I'd started noticing the same problem over and over. Nobody in that world had software built for how they actually worked. Everything on the market was built for companies 10 times their size. I didn't tell Claire's family that I was quietly building something out of that problem. I barely told Claire, not because I didn't trust her, but because it wasn't real yet. It was a folder on my laptop labeled routing_v3, and a lot of nights after my paid work was done. Her family found out I existed before they found out what I did. That was the order it always happened in, with them. The first dinner at the Whitfield house, I wore a blazer Claire had picked out with me, standing in a Nordstrom fitting room laughing at how stiff I looked in it. Her father shook my hand like he was testing the grip strength of a stranger. Her mother asked where my family was from, and when I said Gastonia, something in her face did a small, polite recalculation. "And what is it you do, Nathan?" Richard asked, over the second course. "I do data consulting," I said, "mostly for regional distribution companies. Logistics, inventory, that kind of thing." "Consulting for who?" I named 2 companies he'd never heard of because they were regional and small and exactly the kind of businesses his world didn't look at twice. "Interesting," he said, in the tone people use when something is the opposite of interesting to them, and moved the conversation to Claire's brother Grant, who'd just made VP at the firm their grandfather started. I didn't take it personally, not at first. I told myself it was normal, that fathers were like that with any man dating their daughter, that it would soften. Claire squeezed my hand under the table twice that night, which I understood, correctly. As an apology, she couldn't say out loud yet. The cracks came slow, the way they do. Not one dinner. 100 small ones. Her brother Grant, at a 4th of July cookout, asking me if I'd thought about getting into something more scalable, said with the specific cruelty of someone who thinks he's being helpful. Her mother mentioning, unprompted, that Claire's college roommate had married a surgeon. Richard asking, every few months, some version of the same question. What's the plan? Where's this going? What happens when Claire wants a house in Myers Park? And me giving some version of the same answer, vague enough that it never satisfied him and never fully lied either. I proposed in March, on the Greenway by the Little Sugar Creek. Nothing fancy, no photographer hiding in the bushes, just me and a ring I'd saved for 11 months to afford. Claire cried in a way that had nothing performative in it, and for about 6 weeks I let myself believe none of the rest of it mattered. Then the engagement dinner happened, and it mattered again. Richard stood up with a glass of wine, said all the right things about welcoming me to the family, and then, near the end, added, almost as an afterthought, Claire's always had good instincts. I trust she sees something in Nathan the rest of us just haven't gotten to yet. Everyone laughed like it was warm. It wasn't. Claire's hand found mine under the table again, tighter this time. That was the pattern for months. Small, deniable. Nothing you could point to and call cruelty. Just enough that I started rehearsing answers before dinners, started dressing more carefully, started feeling, for the first time in my life, like I needed to prove I belonged somewhere. I didn't tell Claire how much it was getting to me. I told myself I was protecting her from having to choose between us. Looking back, I think I was protecting myself from finding out what she'd choose. The folder on my laptop kept growing. I'd started calling it something real by then, Loadline, and I'd gotten 3 of Pete's old distributor contacts to pilot it for free, just to see if the routing actually saved them money. It did. 11% fewer miles driven in the first month for one of them, which doesn't sound like much until you're the guy paying for diesel. I told Claire about the pilots over dinner one night, actually excited, and she listened the way she always did, fully, both elbows on the table. That's incredible, Nate, she said. You should tell my dad about this. I will, I said. When it's more than 3 guys running it for free, he'd probably respect that more than you think. I didn't believe her, and some small, tired part of me didn't want to test it and lose. The night that changed things, the point where I stopped bothering to explain myself to her family at all, happened at her parents' anniversary party in September at their house on Providence Road, string lights over the back terrace, a bartender who knew everyone's order by the second glass. Richard had had 3 bourbons and a good week at the firm, which made him expansive in the specific way that meant something unkind was coming, dressed up as a joke. You know, he said, to a small circle that included 2 of his partners and their wives. I keep waiting for Nathan here to tell me what he actually does. Every time I ask, it's a different answer. Spreadsheets. Consulting. Routing. I told Diane. Maybe he doesn't know either. A ripple of laughter. Easy. The kind that costs the person laughed at more than the people laughing. I felt my face do something I couldn't fully control. Claire's hand found my arm. Dad? She said, quiet, warning. I'm not saying anything wrong, Richard said, still smiling. I like the kid. I just think Claire deserves someone with a real trajectory. Is that so terrible to say out loud? Nobody answered him, which was its own kind of answer. I excused myself to get another drink I didn't want, and stood at the bar longer than I needed to. And when Claire found me there 10 minutes later, she didn't apologize for him. She said, he doesn't mean it the way it sounds, which was worse than an apology because it meant she'd heard it enough times to have a defense ready. Does it sound different to you? I asked. She didn't answer that either. I want to be fair to her, because she was never the villain in this, and I never once believed she was. Claire was 31, the only daughter in a family that had built its identity around visible success for 3 generations, and she loved her father in the complicated, loyal way you love someone who raised you and also occasionally embarrasses you in front of the person you're planning to marry. She wasn't choosing him over me. She was doing what a lot of people do when they've never had to choose. She was hoping, quietly, that she wouldn't have to. That fall, though, the hoping started running out of road. I picked up 2 more pilot clients for Loadline, still unpaid, still nights and weekends, and I started sketching out what a real version of the business would look like. Actual pricing, actual infrastructure, actual funding. If I could ever get anyone with money to take a regional trucking software tool seriously. I didn't say any of this at Whitfield family dinners anymore. I'd learned that whatever I said there got measured against Grant's promotion or Richard's newest deal and came up short every time, no matter what it actually was. Claire noticed the quiet. She asked about it more than once, in bed, in the dark, in the specific tone she used when she actually wanted an answer instead of a reassurance. You've stopped telling me things, she said, one night in October. I tell you things. You tell me the outline. You used to tell me the whole thing. She was quiet a second. Is it because of my family? I could have lied. I almost did. I got tired of watching it get turned into a joke, I said instead. She didn't defend them that time. She just put her head on my chest and said, I know, which felt like the most honest thing anyone in that family had said to me in a year. Thanksgiving came again, the one I opened with. Standing in the hallway with 2 warm glasses of wine, listening to Richard describe me like a return he was still deciding whether to make. I didn't confront him that night. I walked back in, handed Claire her wine, sat through the rest of dinner, and drove home with my jaw tight the whole way, saying almost nothing. Claire asked if I was okay in the car. I said I was tired. She didn't push, which I understood, even then, as its own kind of quiet surrender. What I did instead of confronting anyone was go home and open the folder on my laptop and work until 2 in the morning. If nobody in that dining room was going to believe there was anything real in what I was building, I decided I wasn't going to spend one more dinner trying to convince them. I was just going to build it. The next 10 months are the part of this story that used to feel, to me, like the boring part, the part I'd have skipped over if I were telling it to a friend over beers. It wasn't boring while I was living it. It was the hardest stretch of my adult life. But I've learned since then that the boring parts are usually where the actual change happens, quietly, while everyone's attention is somewhere else. I quit the freelance spreadsheet work in January, which meant 6 weeks of eating a lot of rice and beans and not telling Claire how close to empty my savings account actually got. I built out a real pricing model for Loadline, cold emailed 40 regional distribution companies across 3 states, and got 3 replies, one of which was a polite no. The other 2 became my first paying clients. $800 a month each. It wasn't a business yet. It was proof of concept with an invoice attached. I told Claire about the paid clients, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself sound proud when I said it. She hugged me so hard, she knocked my coffee over. Are you going to tell my dad? She asked, half joking. Not yet, I said. Let it be something before it's something I have to defend. She didn't argue with that. I think, by then, she understood it better than I gave her credit for. Spring brought the first real setback, and it came close to sinking the whole thing. My second paying client, a produce distributor out of Winston-Salem, had a bad month. Not because of my software, but because of a supplier issue that had nothing to do with routing, and the owner, panicking, canceled the contract and told 2 other distributors in his network that the software had cost him money, which wasn't true, but truth travels slower than a scared man's phone calls. I lost a signed deal I'd been counting on the following week. Whoever he'd talked to had gotten there first. I sat in my apartment that night with my laptop open to a spreadsheet that suddenly had a lot fewer zeros in it than it had that morning, and for about 2 hours I let myself seriously consider quitting. Not just Loadline. All of it. Getting a normal job with a normal title Richard Whitfield could say out loud without smirking. Claire came over that night. I hadn't even called her. She just showed up because apparently my silence over text had been loud enough to hear from across town. And she sat on the floor of my apartment with me, going through the numbers, not offering to fix anything, just being there while I stared at them. You built something that worked, she said, eventually. One guy panicking doesn't undo that. Feels like it does. It doesn't. She took the laptop out of my hands and closed it. Not tonight. Look at it again tomorrow. I did. In the morning it looked exactly as bad, but somehow more survivable. I rebuilt from there, slower and more carefully. I called the 2 distributors who'd heard the bad rumor and offered them a free month to test it themselves instead of taking someone else's word for it. Both said yes. Both stayed on as paying clients within 6 weeks, and one of them, a guy named Walt who ran a beverage distribution outfit out of Salisbury, became something close to a mentor, gruff, unsentimental, the kind of man who'd never once asked me what my 5-year plan was, because he only cared whether the software worked on Tuesday. You remind me of myself in '91. He told me once, watching me eat a gas station sandwich in his warehouse office at 7 a.m. because I'd driven up before my day job even started. Except I didn't have a computer. I had a legal pad and a bad temper. By June, Loadline had 11 paying clients across the Carolinas and Virginia, still small, still me doing support calls at midnight, but real. Real enough that a logistics software company out of Atlanta, a real one, with a real office and 40 employees, reached out after hearing about the routing model from one of my clients at a trade show. They didn't want to buy it. Not yet. They wanted to talk. I didn't tell the Whitfields any of this. I told Claire, in careful pieces, watching her carry the information like something she wasn't sure was allowed to make her this happy in front of her family. We went to 2 more of their dinners that spring, and each time, Richard asked some version of the same tired question, and I gave some version of the same vague answer, and Claire's jaw tightened a little more each time, though she never said anything at the table. She said something after, though. In July, driving home from a dinner where Grant had spent 20 minutes describing a deal his firm had closed, Claire pulled the car over on Providence Road, put it in park, and said, "I can't keep sitting there anymore." "I don't need you to fight my battles," I said. "I'm not talking about fighting your battles." Her hands were still on the wheel. "I'm talking about the fact that I've spent 2 years letting my family decide who you are without ever telling them what I actually know. That's not protecting you, Nate. That's cowardice. Mine, not yours." I didn't have an answer for that. I just reached over and put my hand over hers on the wheel, and we sat there in the dark for a while, not talking, the engine ticking as it cooled. The Atlanta company came back in August with a real offer, not an acquisition, but a licensing partnership, 6 figures up front plus a percentage of new client revenue, enough to hire my first 2 employees and finally stop doing support calls from my car in a Costco parking lot. I said yes on a Tuesday. I told Claire that night, and she cried in the good way this time and asked, again, gently, if I was ready to tell her family. "Not yet," I said. "Let it get bigger first. I want it to be undeniable before I hand it to them." She nodded and didn't argue, though I could tell some part of her wanted this over with, wanted to stop managing the space between her fiancé and her father. By October, Loadline had grown to 19 employees, a real office in a converted warehouse in Noda, and a signed letter of intent from a mid-sized logistics conglomerate in Charlotte itself, Faro Logistics, a company whose name Richard Whitfield's own investment firm had, coincidentally, looked at acquiring 2 years earlier and passed on. Faro wanted to buy Loadline outright, fold it into their operations software, keep me on as a director. The number they offered was more money than I'd ever expected to see attached to my own name in my lifetime. I signed the letter of intent on a Thursday in early November. The deal was set to close and be publicly announced the following week, right before Thanksgiving. I didn't plan it that way. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a better story if I'd engineered the timing on purpose, waited a year to walk into that dining room and detonate something satisfying. I didn't. Business deals close when lawyers finish paperwork, not when narratives need them to. It just happened that the Faro acquisition became public the same week as the Whitfield family's annual Thanksgiving gathering, the biggest one of the year, the one with the extended cousins and the family friends and Richard's law partners and half of Myers Park on the guest list. Claire and I drove to her parents' house that Thursday the same way we had the year before, me a little tense in the collar of a shirt she'd picked out, her hand resting on my knee at every red light. I hadn't told her family anything. I hadn't even told Claire the deal had officially closed 2 days earlier. I'd wanted to tell her in person, quietly, before dinner, and then the house had been too full of arriving relatives for a quiet moment to exist. Dinner went the way it always went. Grant talked about his firm's fourth-quarter numbers. Richard's law partner asked me, with the same rehearsed politeness as always, what I did for work, and I said, "I run a logistics software company," which was true and which nobody at the table registered as anything more than a slightly better version of the same vague answer I always gave. It was Claire's cousin, scrolling her phone under the table the way people do at every family dinner now, who looked up first. "Wait," she said. "Isn't that you?" She turned her phone around. The Charlotte Business Journal's push alert was on the screen, the kind of local headline that goes out to every subscriber's lock screen at exactly 7:42 p.m. Faro Logistics acquires local software startup Loadline in 8-figure deal. Founder Nathan Cole TO joined AS Director of Operations Tech. There's a specific kind of silence that happens when 12 conversations at one table all stop within the same half second. I'd never experienced it before that night. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Someone's wine glass stayed lifted, untouched. Richard's fork actually made a small sound against his plate as he set it down, too carefully, the way people set things down when they need a second to rearrange their face. "That's," Grant started, staring at his own phone now, which had lit up with the same alert. "That's an 8-figure deal." "It is," I said. I didn't say it triumphantly. I'd promised myself, somewhere in the last year, that if this moment ever came, I wouldn't make it about winning. I just said it the way you'd confirm any other fact. Richard's face did something complicated. Not quite embarrassment, not quite pride, something caught between both. a man recalculating a year of dinner table comments in real time. You built that, he said. Not a question. Almost to himself. I've been building it for 2 years, I said. Since before the engagement dinner, actually. Nobody said anything for a moment. Claire's hand found mine under the table, the way it always did, except this time it wasn't an apology. It was something closer to relief. Why didn't you ever say anything? Richard asked, and there was something almost wounded in it, which surprised me more than the acquisition alert had. I thought about the honest answer, because every time I tried, you turned it into a joke before I finished the sentence, and I chose a gentler version of the truth instead, because I'd also promised myself I wouldn't spend this moment settling scores. I wanted it to be real before I brought it to this table, I said. I didn't want to be measured against something I hadn't finished yet. Richard nodded slowly, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't have a follow-up question ready. The rest of that dinner didn't turn into a celebration, exactly, and I'm glad it didn't, because a sudden pivot into congratulations would have felt exactly as false as the 2 years of quiet dismissal that came before it. People asked careful questions. Grant, to his credit, asked good ones, about the routing algorithm, about how I'd landed the first pilot clients, actually listening this time instead of waiting for his turn to talk about his own numbers. Claire didn't say much during any of it. She just held my hand under the table and, once, when nobody was watching, pressed her forehead briefly against my shoulder, the way she used to on her stairwell landing 2 years earlier, back when neither of us had anything to prove to anyone. Later that night, after most of the relatives had left and it was just her parents, Claire, and me in the kitchen while Diane wrapped leftovers, Richard found me by the back door, where I'd stepped out for air. I owe you an apology, he said. He didn't dress it up. More than one, probably. You don't owe me anything, I said, and meant it. You didn't know. I didn't ask, he said. There's a difference. He looked out at the dark yard for a second. I spent a lot of dinners deciding what kind of man you were without ever actually finding out. That's on me, not on you. I didn't need the apology by then, not really. The version of me that had stood in that same hallway a year earlier, holding 2 warm glasses of wine, listening to himself get measured and found wanting. That version had needed it badly. This version, standing by the back door with an 8-figure deal signed and a fiancée who'd finally stopped apologizing for her family in the car, didn't need it the way I once would have. But I took it anyway, because it was honestly offered, and because refusing it would have made the moment about pride instead of peace. Thank you, I said. I mean that. Claire and I got married the following June, in a backyard in Plaza Midwood that belonged to no one's family fortune, string lights strung between 2 oak trees by Walt's beverage distribution guys, who'd volunteered without being asked. Richard gave a toast that didn't mention ambition once. He talked instead about the night his key broke and I'd apparently, according to Claire, been the only person in the building patient enough to help her, months before either of us knew what any of this would become. I still think about that hallway sometimes, the ice not moving in my glass, the sound of a room deciding who I was without asking me. I don't think about it with anger anymore. Mostly I think about how much of that year I spent building something in silence, not because I wanted to prove anyone wrong, but because I'd stopped needing them to be right about me in order to know who I actually was. That's the part nobody in that dining room could have seen coming. The night they decided I wasn't ambitious enough. It was never really about ambition. It was about whether I trusted my own quiet work enough to let it speak for itself, eventually, in its own time, instead of defending it at a dinner table where it was never going to be believed anyway. It spoke for itself, in the end. Not loudly, just enough.